If you've ever dabbled in science fiction at any point in your life, you'll have no doubt ended up at some point with something Gerry Anderson has touched sat in front of you. This is because over the 70 years that he was alive and producing content along with his wife Sylvia, the man practically rewrote the rulebook on traditional science fiction. Their influences stretch out well above and beyond British television, and probably his most influential area of expertise lay in that of puppeteering. Anderson practically invented a new style of puppeteering over the course of his career, and while Supermarionation was last seen being used to its fullest effect in the 2004 Trey Parker and Matt Stone comedy Team America World Police, it's still a technique that would get the odd dusting off even to this day. Most recently in the resurrection of 3 of Anderson's radio adaptations of Thunderbirds, which were finally brought back to life on the small screen. How sprawling is Anderson's production history? Very is the short answer to that question. Well, the essentials were Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, Joe 90 and Stingray. How big were these shows? Well, taking Thunderbirds as an example, there hasn't been a decade yet since the 1960s where it hasn't been on television in one format or another. And in the 1990s, Matchbox released a version of Tracy Island, the home of Thunderbirds International Rescue, just in time for Christmas, only for it to sell out so hard that the perennial favourites Blue Peter had to step in and help frustrated parents out by showing them how to build their own out of washing up bottles and bits of string. While Anderson had success in parts of Europe, and he's absolutely massive in Japan, for some of the reasons that I've mentioned in my Gamera review, his shows have never quite taken off in the States. There have been many attempts to capitalise on this over the decades, but nothing's really stuck. I can't say exactly why, honestly. Maybe it's because Anderson's shows were heavily inspired by American comic books, and the idea of an idealised IGY America. So much so that an American audience simply can't relate to it in the same way that downtrodden and rained-on British people can. British people aspired for a world where it was all heroes and adventures and running around and gathering around the piano for a bar or two. But to the US at that time, they'd just come out of that period of aspiration and were heading into the hedonistic days of the mid to late 60s and 70s. To US citizens of that time, Anderson's work must have come across as positively square. But to tell us more about Anderson's influence, here's a good friend and overall Anderson master, Alex. Take it away.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you for letting me join you to discuss the work of my hero, Gerry Anderson. Anderson's work came from a melting pot of influences. These included a love of American cinema, most notably Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, a fascination with aircraft, and a hero worship of his older brother, Lionel Anderson. The Americano influence is recognisable from the forward-thinking, upbeat nature of his shows. The vast scope of Gerry's ideas and the fast pace with which they're executed has its roots in Hollywood movies, which, let's face it, have always contained more emphasis on spectacle and drama over their European counterparts. That his brother would later take part in an American feature film called The Thunderbirds did nothing to quell young Gerry's enthusiasm for US cinema. It should be noted, however, that Gerry himself never actually visited America until the mid-1960s, by which time he had become a successful TV and film producer in his own right. The impact Lionel had on Gerry's work cannot be overstated. If you look at any Gerry Anderson series, you are likely to find some variation or another of the hero pilot character. Regardless of whether they are an actual test pilot, such as Mike Mercury, an astronaut like Steve Zodiac, or an aquanaut in the case of Troy Tempest, All of these heroes are inspired by Lionel and how much Gerry looked up to him. What many considered to be Gerry's masterpiece, Thunderbirds, went on to give us 5 variations of the hero pilot character. Furthermore, Captain Scarlet, Joe 90, and even Stanley Unwin seemed to be adept at handling any contraption involving wings. And it all comes back to a small boy's devotion to his older brother, being thrilled by his wartime adventures. You make interesting points, Dan, on why the Anderson productions never took off stateside. Gerry's son Jamie once said that the shows were love letters to both America and the future by people who'd never been to either. So you'd think that they'd go down a treat in the good old patriotic US of A. Not so apparently. In my experience, it's been very difficult to find Anderson fans amongst everyday American folk. Though, that being said, some guys called George Lucas and Christopher Nolan were apparently inspired by Anderson's work, so clearly the shows made some kind of impact. Just nowhere near the same extent as in Europe, and especially Japan.
It could be argued that the 1980s were when they tried their biggest push to date to try and make Anderson happen stateside. In 1982, or 1986, depending on which sources you read from, a New York-based production company known as Dolphin Productions were allowed to revisit the hit shows and re-edit them into a concise TV movie-style package. They would take 3 or 4 episodes of one of their franchises, update the effects with new Brillo wow digital effects, redub some of the dialogue and restructure the scripts in order to make a 90-minute long feature-length version of their stories. The most famous of these would probably be Revenge of the Mysterons from Mars and Invaders of the Deep, the former being a supercut of Captain Scarlet and the latter a supercut of Stingray. Both of these were featured as episodes of the original KTMA run of Mystery Science Theatre 3000. They're not great episodes, but they've probably been seen more than any of the other films because of this.
Today though, Dan and I are going to be talking about the other Stingray film. The Incredible Voyage of Stingray, which was technically the first of the 2 Stingray films to be produced for US television. It supercuts elements of the pilot and episodes 2, 9 and 23 to create a full 90-minute feature. The movie follows the adventures of Captain Troy Tempest, Phones and Marina, the crew of Stingray, the flagship submarine of the World Aquanaut Security Patrol, aka WASP. The World Aquanaut Security Patrol was set up to monitor Earth's oceans for strange activity. It's run from a base called Marineville, where Stingray is housed, the craft gaining access to the sea via an underground tunnel and ocean door. The organisation is led by Commander Shaw, who is assisted by his daughter and Lieutenant Atlanta. The film opens with Commander Shaw sending Captain Troy Tempest and his colleague Phones on a mission in Stingray to investigate the mysterious destruction of another WASP sub. However, Stingray is also attacked, and Troy and Phones experience first contact with underwater aliens when they are captured by Titan, an evil undersea lord who rules over the domain of Titanica. Whilst imprisoned, Troy befriends Marina, a mute girl from a peaceful undersea race who was taken from her father by Titan and made into his slave. Teaming up with Troy and Phones, Marina frees the Aquanauts and helps them to retrieve Stingray. Returning with her new friends to Marineville, Marina quickly makes it clear that she misses her home of Pacifica and wants to see her father again. Troy convinces Commander Shaw to let Phones and himself take Marina home in Stingray, in the hopes of building peaceful relations with another undersea race. Meanwhile, an enraged Titan chooses to exact vengeance on Troy Tempest and the people of Pacifica by using a poisonous undersea flower as a weapon. Titan orders one of his surface agents, X-20, to deliver the deadly flower to Pacifica disguised as a gift, so it will secrete its toxic perfume, killing them all. When Marina decides to go back to Marineville with Troy and Phones, she unwittingly brings the dangerous plant with her. Atlanta Shore is nearly killed by the flower's deadly scent, leading Marina to be suspected as a traitor. Luckily, Troy is able to prove her innocence, and Marina is formally made a member of the World Aquanaut Security Patrol. Unshaken on his plans for revenge, Titan gives X-20 orders to destroy Marineville itself. Whilst her new friends decorate an apartment for her, Marina is captured by the surface agent, who straps her to a bomb that he plants within the base. Troy, however, is able to foil his plan by uncovering the explosive, freeing Marina, and getting it out of Marineville just in time for it to detonate harmlessly. This narrow defeat for the villains sets up the final act, where Titan executes his most devious scheme yet, poisoning Troy Tempest in order to lure Marina back into his clutches in exchange for the cure. Marina gladly sacrifices her freedom for Troy, however, this is all part of a larger plan. Titan sends the antidote to Marineville, knowing that once cured, Troy will come and rescue his slave, so he sets a trap for the brave Aquanaut. Fortunately, Troy and Phones have anticipated this. They gain access to Titanica in a disguised craft and storm the throne room. An epic gun battle unfolds, in which Troy and Phones defeat Titan and his guards. They escape with Marina. Having once again been proven a match for Titan, Stingray and its crew return to the safety of Marineville, leaving the evil Sea Lord to curse yet another humiliating defeat at the hands of Troy Tempest.
The first thing that'll hit you if you've never seen an Anderson production is just how upbeat the whole thing is. For a show that's about trouble, battles and adventure, and even moments when all seem lost, it's peppered with a can-do attitude. It's totally refreshing. There's no irony, no self-awareness. This is unbridled, upbeat adventure at its finest. And to just be able to sit down and sink 93 minutes of fun and adventure with a crew under the ocean like that was a wonderful turn up for the books, in honesty. Yes, the dialogue isn't the sharpest in the world. Yes, there are a few lines that read a bit jittery to my 21st century ears, but considering that this was a kids' show, written for kids at a time when kids' shows were treated with contempt rather than craftsmanship, this is pretty bloody brilliant. There are ideas in here that are well ahead of their time, and as mentioned, the aspirations that Anderson creates in this universe, where humanity are exploring their planet and beyond in the hopes of building a utopia, are honestly quite palate cleansing, especially considering the streak of political and social turbulence we as a collective have been experiencing for the past few years.
The upbeat, pulpish, boys' own adventure feel is hardly surprising given the background of the writers. Along with Gerry and Sylvia Anderson, who wrote the pilot episode, the instalments that make up the rest of this compilation film were individually scripted by Alan Fennell, writer of episodes 2 and 23, and Dennis Spooner, who penned episode 9. Alan Fennell was a renowned comic strip writer and editor, best known for adapting and expanding the Anderson universe within the action-filled pages of TV Comic and TV 21. Doctor Who fans will know Dennis Spooner for his contributions as writer and story editor throughout the William Hartnell era, in addition to being that man who helped develop Patrick Troughton's debut story, Power of the Daleks. As you've gathered, the sci-fi fantasy credentials of both men are well spoken for. What struck me most about re-watching this compilation film is how well structured it is. Considering the movie is just effectively meant to be a showreel for the wider series, the fact it narratively hangs together as well as it does is very impressive. It also must be noted that Marina has a pretty decent character arc throughout this film that is akin to the traditional hero's journey model. She escapes the servitude of Titan, joins the Stingray crew, gradually gains their trust, and in the final act of the movie, sacrifices herself to her old master in order to save one of her closest friends. That's quite a solid arc for a character who isn't even meant to be the hero, and which has been constructed through the editing together of 4 separate TV episodes. This was either a well thought out plan by production coordinator Robert Mandel, or a glorious piece of serendipity.
The direction is equally really superb, and for its time, I'd argue it's pretty revolutionary. In a time where most of, if not all, television output was presented as static camera shots on a soundstage with hand-painted backdrops, where the best you'd probably get is a tracking shot from one set to another, to see here stylisation and cinematography that wouldn't have been out of place in films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, a full 4 years before 2001 would even be released, is frankly mind-blowing. Sequences such as where Trojan phones are being loaded into Stingray have a shot structure and stylisation that you just couldn't replicate with actors. That was one of the joys of the Supermarionation process. It allowed for the scale and scope of the production to soar well above the actual size of the puppets and props. Simply because the sets could be custom built to accommodate the shots, and as they were all to scale models, you could realistically film a building being blown up, or make a prop that was literally an entire city shifting into an underground bunker. It meant that the only limitation was your imagination, and the Andersons knew and used this well. As a result, I really can't fault what's presented here. If I had to gripe, I'd say that the new effects, largely laser blasts if I'm being honest, are a little bit out of place. But that's mainly because they were 80s effects being overlaid onto 60s film stock. It'd be a bit like superimposing VHS effects onto a Blu-ray copy of a film as a modern comparison. Though I imagine at the time they must have been pretty impressive.
Yeah, as someone who went on to watch the rest of this series outside of the 2 compilation films, it confused me as to why Stingray would sometimes fire lasers and other times sting missiles. I guess these effects were added to make the production look, for want of a better term, more Star Wars-y, to keep up with trends in the 1980s, as you will find that many action-adventure cartoons from that era, G.I. Joe, He-Man, Thundercats, etc., contain a gargantuan amount of laser fire. To complement the new laser effects, a new sound was added to accompany each laser blast whenever one is fired. Although to a small child this seems pretty cool, to a supposed adult who has watched the series in its entirety, both these additional visual and audio effects just come over as cheesy and extremely dated. This is especially true of the sound effect, as they don't even bother with replacing the old one. The post-production team just superimposed the new sound over the original, which makes it incredibly jarring to hear. The undoctored effects from the original episodes themselves, however, still stand up to this day and are a thing of beauty. The added effects were created by Dolphin Productions, a New York-based organisation that operated from the early 1970s through to the mid-80s. This company made graphics for film and TV productions using an intriguing animation cum graphic design technique known as Scanimate. Although Dolphin's work may look hokey by today's sky-high standards, from watching an old company showreel online, their stuff was pretty groundbreaking back in the day, and could quite possibly have inspired the later efforts of George Lucas. So, credit where credit is due.
On the subject of stylised direction, I think it goes without saying that the cinematography is up there to match this unique and wonderful direction. There's a fluid and almost effortless crafting of shots that are used at just the right time to the maximum effect. The narrative of Stingray as a series was always quite largely visually driven, and the subtlety with which the cinematographers have worked here so as to mask the more obvious elements of the puppeteering, while also maximising the creative output of their work where possible, is very impressive to say the least. I can't fully throw my support behind the Cine direction on this TV movie because it's a supercut of a series, and the directing credits fall to between 3 and 5 people, all of whom helped shoot and direct about 30 of the 39 episodes of Stingray's original run, but as a collective, they're great.
Oh yes, the editing in every Gerry Anderson production is nothing short of gorgeous, and Stingray is no exception. In terms of the editing that goes into connecting together the 4 individual episodes that make up this feature, nothing huge is actually sacrificed. There are only 2 noticeable absences. One is from the end of the second episode, Plant of Doom, where the final scene has been removed, and the only other cut is from the beginning of the next instalment in the film, Countdown. The episode originally opened with a suspenseful scene where Troy, Phones, Atlanta and Commander Shaw all convene in the Marine War Control Tower to discuss some top secret documents linked to a mysterious undercover operation. It is only revealed later that the secret plans are in fact apartment designs, and the undercover mission is to decorate Marina's home so she feels more welcome living on land.
The soundtrack's pretty marvellous as well. With a largely orchestra-based soundtrack, the opening theme for Stingray is as energetic, powerful and encapsulating of the show today as it was back in 1964. It's amazingly good, and the end theme's ballad is equally soothing and a delight to the ears. It really boosts the production's quality in my opinion, and had the soundtrack been anything less than this, I think it would have really drastically been to the detriment of the show's overall impact.
The funny thing about this movie's soundtrack is that it features a lot of Barry Gray's wonderful incidental music, which plays over pretty much every scene. This is different to the original uncut episodes, which don't contain nearly as much music as in this film. I was strangely disappointed when I first compared the two, as how can you ever have too much Barry Gray? The Stingray theme alone is one of his greatest triumphs. Although as an older person I can concede that the repetitive use of the exact same motifs can become grating, I'll also say that the added music actually gives the episodes a much more cinematic feel. A good specific use of additional music in this film is a great musical sting that marks the first appearance of Titan, something which is absent from the uncut episode. For me, as far as music is concerned, this is an instance of where the compilation movie is actually better than the original source material. The sting punctuates the moment, setting Titan up as one hell of a sinister force to be reckoned with, in the same league as Darth Vader.
I also can't go any further without talking about the cast, all of whom do their best exaggerated American accents for this one, and all of whom are utter caricatures. Endearing caricatures, but caricatures nonetheless. With Surface Agent X-20 being a blatant lift of Peter Lorre, and the remaining cast all playing various spins on the army soldier type of gruff inflection. Again, unsurprising considering that WASP is deemed to be a protection agency, but it's a welcome addition to British television to hear some American and Canadian voice acting on display here. The Incredible Voyages of Stingray was never, to my knowledge at least, formally broadcast on UK television. However, it was broadcast in the States, to little fanfare. This was deemed another one of the unsuccessful attempts to get it out there. It was, however, later released on VHS in the UK at some point in the late 1980s. Again, the sources are a little bit mixed as to exactly when this was. Based on the polygram logo at the start and end of the copy that I have, I would say it couldn't be any earlier than 1988, but it's absolutely no later than 1994. That's purely going off other tapes that I have in my collection that share the polygram logo for reference, though.
I believe, Dan, that The Incredible Voyage of Stingray was first broadcast in 1980. Whether that was here or in the US, I have no clue, but according to IMDb, it had a 1980 release date. And of course, they never lie. Ever.
Ah, thanks for the clarification. These films have never been formally released on DVD or Blu-ray, and in many ways it's quite understandable as to why. Almost all of Anderson's work has been released uncut in their serialised formats on DVD, and some are now even available on Blu-ray. These TV movies were edited and formatted to be presented as 4:3 SD analogue presentations. You could upscale these and possibly get a higher quality copy, but short of painstakingly recreating them using new HD sources, there really isn't that much point in re-releasing these. They came out at a time when tape stock had its limits, and sometimes omnibus cuts or best-ofs were the only way to really squeeze a series onto a tape. There are multiple volumes of Scarlet, Thunderbirds and Stingray released on tape. Most of them are the uncut episodes, but the first few volumes of these were recut into this format, presumably to help establish the plot to a younger audience as easily as possible, alongside being a space-saving tactic. And while the people who grew up with them will have a great affinity with these cuts in particular, they're simply defunct at this point. A great footnote on the continually growing bill that is the Anderson legacy. I think they should be preserved, but even I would be hard-pressed to find a scenario where these films would be relevant in the face of a fully remastered box set.
Oh, heck yes! This is where I respectfully disagree with you, Dan. I'd buy a re-release of these compilation films in a shot. But alas, that's probably just me thinking like a nostalgic fanboy. You are right though. From a purely commercial standpoint, there is no real logic to reissuing these movies, as the uncut episodes of each Anderson series are already available on DVD. Furthermore, the Anderson shows get re-released every few years anyway, to bring in new fans, and also, to be brutally honest, so corporations can retain the rights and line their pockets. Still, I maintain that I'd buy a reissue of the compilation films in a heartbeat, and if they can track down any of the crew behind the editing and additional effects for either a documentary or commentary, then so much the better. Interestingly enough, these films actually served as an introduction for my generation to the many Anderson series when they were re-released in the early 1990s on UK home video. For years, my friends and I were convinced the films were pilot episodes in of themselves, and actually how each series was intended to unfold. Imagine my shock much later when I discovered these great things called episode guides that revealed the shattering truth that the movies from my boyhood were in fact singular episodes, cut up and spliced together in an attempt to create one whole overarching story.
Do I think you should check out Stingray? Absolutely. I have very fond memories of sitting with my dad watching these episodes as a kid, and then again as an adult. And I can honestly say that it isn't nostalgia talking when I tell you that it's probably my favourite Anderson series, and it's definitely worth checking out. It's a lot gentler than series like Thunderbirds or Scarlet, and its pick up and drop nature means that you can dip in for a few episodes and then dip out for a while without having to really remember all the specific details of the show's backstory. It's been nice to revisit this series really, and if you haven't seen them, I can highly recommend you go and look them up. Can I recommend this film? No, for two reasons. First, in order to watch this movie, short of torrenting it, you'd need to hunt down a VHS copy that wasn't frazzled by years of being in the hands of children, followed by a VCR to even be able to watch the thing. Second, it's not the best representation of the show in working motion. It's a little bit bloated in places, and while the episodes zip by with a great pace, this film did have me starting to clock watch towards the end.
Is The Incredible Voyage of Stingray essential viewing? By no means. And given how hard it is to source a copy nowadays, that might be for the best. However, it is entertaining if you are lucky enough to watch it, as it's a good film for nostalgic adults, and will go down a treat with kids who love adventure stories and cool tech. It got me into watching Stingray as a series, serving as a nice introduction to the show. And both my parents can attest that it was not uncommon to find The Incredible Voyage of Stingray VHS regularly playing on our family TV.